Hello and welcome back to the Transgender Education Workshop. This is video 2 in this series. In the last video, we talked about, words, pronouns, names, all of those kinds of things. In this video, we're going to be talking about transgender experiences, the transition process, how that works for different people, and then we're also going to do a brief activity. So starting off with this section, I want to talk about gender dysphoria. Gender dysphoria is a diagnosable mental illness. It is in the DSM-5. And the way I like to explain gender dysphoria is it is a specific kind of anxiety and mental distress that comes from being assigned the wrong gender at birth and how that relates to your body. Again, I don't like to speak for everyone as a whole. I like to relate to my own personal experiences when explaining things. But for me, as a transgender man, my gender dysphoria manifested in I was assigned female at birth. When I went through puberty, I went through all of the pubescent changes that we associate in our society with females, breast development, the way body fat distributes, no facial hair, no voice drop, all of those kinds of things. And so as I, grew up and started to realize, okay, like I am male, I am transgender, there was a disconnect between, who I knew I was and the way that my body presented itself. And so for me, part of my gender dysphoria treatment was medically transitioning, and we're going to get into that in a few slides. Gender dysphoria is, a diagnosable mental illness. Something that's really important to note is that being transgender is not. There's a reason that transgender is not a mental illness that you will see in the DSM. There's a reason for that, and it's because being transgender is not a mental illness. Sometimes people who are transgender do have gender dysphoria, in the same way that sometimes people who are transgender have depression or anxiety, but that does not make the experience of being transgender a mental illness in and of itself. It is just a normal part of human variation, normal part of the human experience. People exist in diversity, people exist in multitudes. And so I wanted to make that very clear, because sometimes people misconstrue that, oh, okay, there's this thing associated with being transgender that is a mental illness, therefore being transgender is a mental illness. It's not. And something also that's important to note about gender dysphoria, that while it is a mental illness, the prescribed treatment for this mental illness is transitioning. It is taking hormones, having surgeries, socially transitioning, all of these kinds of things. And so sometimes people like to say, oh, it's a mental illness, it needs to be cured. Not necessarily. Gender dysphoria isn't something necessarily that is cured. It is something where you have to make changes in your life to affirm your gender identity and therefore lessen your gender dysphoria. So, I just talked about briefly about a few different things. Let's talk about socially transitioning. This is usually the first step of the transition process. When someone comes out as transgender, coming out is part of socially transitioning, letting people know, hey, I am transgender. And usually that accompanies, a name change, pronoun differences. For me, it was me coming out saying, hi, I am transgender. I use he, him pronouns. My name is Ace now. All of those kinds of things change. Usually clothing also changes as well. People will start presenting differently than they did before to help, align their exterior with their gender identity. For me, this meant moving away from, typical female clothing or feminine clothing and wearing, more things you would find in the men's sections in the stores. And that kind of clothing change usually accompanies a lot of people's social transition. In addition to, name and pronouns, there's also sometimes a language change. For me, before I came out, people would always be like, oh, you're so pretty, and use what are typically seen as effeminate compliments, like, oh, like you're so pretty, you're so sweet, all of those kinds of things. And I don't necessarily mind those words, but usually when people transition, you want to think about, okay, am I referring to this person in a way that is affirming to their gender? Are these compliments or words that I would say to someone, in my case specifically, that, identifies as male? Would I say, oh my God, you're so pretty to my male friends, or, my male cousins, or things like that? And so again, with that name and pronouns, there's also a language change. And if you're unsure about what language is comfortable to a person, what language someone would like to hear in reference to themselves, just ask them, be like, hey, I used to call you pretty. Is that something that's still okay? Or I know I used to call you handsome. Is that something that's still okay? That's still comfortable for you? Just having those conversations can make someone's social transition so much easier. And so now we're going to kind of get into medical transition. This happens in one of two ways, or not that those are mutually exclusive, but there are two kind of paths when it comes to medical transition. There are hormones and supplements, and then there are surgeries and procedures. I'm talking specifically about hormones. For me as a transgender man, my hormone replacement therapy, also called HRT, again, this is a term that is in the Terms You May Not Know packet. I take testosterone injections once a week. I get them prescribed from my doctor. And what these hormones, taking these hormones has done, it has allowed me to grow facial hair. It has made my voice drop. It has changed the way that body fat distributes in my body. It's also changed my hairline, it's changed my face shape. Nothing crazy, nothing life-threatening, but it did make changes, and it continues to make changes to my body that affirm my gender identity. With transgender women or trans feminine individuals, they will take estrogen, they will take testosterone blockers, all of those kinds of things. And that will have different effects. There are certain things hormones can do, and there are certain things hormones can't do. We could be here all day talking about all of the different things that hormones do, but that's kind of just a basic overview of all of those kinds of things. And then you have surgeries and procedures. There are many different kinds of surgeries. Some people think that there's just one surgery, like a sex change surgery. You do that and you're done. And all of a sudden, you're magically a new gender. This gives me the opportunity to kind of talk about how some people do, take hormones and supplements, have surgeries and procedures done, but that is not necessary. And not all transgender people choose to undergo, these procedures or go down this route. And it's not necessary. People can be 100% valid and legitimate in being transgender without having any hormones or surgeries. It is not a requirement. Going back to surgeries and procedures, people who might want to have surgeries and procedures, there are a myriad of things. There are facial reconstruction type surgeries, that might accentuate different features, file different things down. There are lots of resources, again, online if you want to know more about this. There's also top surgery for people like me, trans men or transmasculine people. Usually it's the removal of breast tissue to, give a flat chest and remove breasts. Sometimes, for trans feminine individuals or trans women, it is, adding supplemental materials, having supplemental surgeries to increase breast size. And then there are also bottom and genital surgeries and things like that. All of these surgeries are optional in the sense that they are not required to be legitimate as a transgender individual. But for those who do choose to go down these paths, these are medical necessities. They are things that are necessary to make this person's life livable, fulfill all of those kinds of needs. So they are both optional and not. This is also a great opportunity to interject that if there's anything during this presentation that you have any questions about, things that aren't quite clear, my email is going to be in the description of all of these videos, as will my website. So you can always reach out to me if you would like to learn more or talk directly to someone who is transgender about these issues. So with all of that education done, there is a little activity. It's called the Privilege Check activity. It is in the Transgender Education Workshop packet. The first page of it should look something like this. You should have a little chart at the bottom. And then the next page of it should be an actual checklist. And I'm going to kind of go over. Normally, in person, this is something that, you would do as a group and compare. This is just, for the online version of this workshop, something you can do by yourself. This is an activity designed to show the nature of privilege through the lens of monetary gains and losses. Every person starts this activity with $30 in their bank. On the following page, you will find a list of statements. For every statement on the privilege checklist that is true for you, you will gain an additional $10 towards your bank. For every statement on the privilege checklist that is not true for you, you will have to pay $10 from your bank. Keep count of the money you gain by making a tally or placing a check mark next to the statement that is applicable to you. Keep account of the money you lose by making a separate tally or placing an X next to the statement that is not applicable to you. Once you have finished the activity, add up your total funds below. And so on this first page, you have the starting bank of $30, you have the money you earned, a subtotal, money you lost, and then a final total. And, there are all of these boxes, and statements that you can check. And so I think, when you get to the end of this activity, think about all the things you can do, and think about all the things you can do, because every item on this list applies to some transgender individual that can't do these things, whether that is due to their gender identity or their sexuality. All of these things are privileges. They are things that not everyone is just guaranteed in life. And take a moment to reflect on that, think about that, sit with that. And at the end, how much money do you have now? How much money did you spend? How much money did you earn? And how does that make you feel? I would love if, anyone doing this at home, you could leave, your thoughts on this activity, how much money you earned and lost and all of those things. You can leave that in the comments. It can kind of function as a digital space where you can interact with your peers who are also doing this. That is the end of this part of the video. I hope to see you in the next one. Thank you so much for watching.